So our speaker today is Dunne from Laidlaw Schools Trust. He's got 13 years English teaching experience, and he's led literacy across 3 previous schools, all with different contexts. Alan's also been a head of English, and is now responsible for English and literacy provision across Laidlaw Schools Trust. Laidlaw Schools Trust is a multi-academy trust comprising of 7 academies and over 5,000 pupils based in the north east of England. Alan's going to talk today about how Laidlaw Schools Trust have used NGRT data to inform appropriate interventions for struggling readers, while ensuring that interventions have significant and worthwhile impact, which is ultimately helping to develop students' reading age as desired. So good morning, Alan. Really appreciate your time today. I know how busy you are, especially with centre assessed grades that we were talking about earlier. So thanks so much. I'm going to hand over to you now to do your presentation.
Perfect. Thanks, Darren. Morning all. I'm going to talk a bit about our trust-wide approach to literacy, in particular reading. I am going to focus very much on the secondary today. We are all through trust. We have primaries and secondaries, and we have all through schools as well. But really speaking, I want to stick on the secondary side of things today for reasons that's where we've really invested in a heavy intervention model based around new group reading test. At primary, we do things a little bit differently, which I'm more than happy to share after the presentation later if anyone's interested. But initially, I ended up doing this because I was asked to talk about how we helped develop reading for students in lockdown. But in order to do that, really, I kind of need to fill you in on the trust-wide approach to developing literacy and reading generally, because without that, we would have had no success in lockdown whatsoever. So on my screen now, you should see some logos. They are the logos of the 3 secondary schools that are in the Laidlaw Schools Trust. They are their teaching model logos. So across the trust, our teaching model is known as IEP, or Inevitable Progress. And the trust is comprised of 3 schools in the northeast, in the green, Sedgefield Community College, and then the 2 in the blue, Academy 360 in Sunderland and Excelsior Academy in Newcastle, where I am sat by a fridge currently for some reason. Now, the teaching model is everything in these schools, and in the middle of there you'll see various logos and things that make up the teaching model, and literacy is a fundamental part of that model, but it's not all of it. Now, as a trust, we serve very, very different contexts, and we serve some of the most challenging contexts in the country. The West End of Newcastle, for instance, at Excelsior today, we have around about 60% pupil premium students, and that's mirrored at Academy 360 in Pennywell in Sunderland, about 60% pupil premium. And what we found with the higher rates of PP students is there is a higher rate of reading deficit in terms of reading age to chronological age, and we need to do something about it. And today I'll talk to you about the policy we've got in place to try and do that, and where that policy's come from. I will focus very much on the reading aspects of the literacy policy. Again, if anyone wants anything else, vocab, oracy, writing, feel free to ask, and I'm more than happy to share what we can share. So first things first, in about 2019 or so, for some reason my slides aren't moving. In about 2019 or so, we really started to dive into reading age, particularly at Excelsior Academy in Newcastle. Now, what we found was, well, what we knew was we were struggling with outcomes, particularly in essay-driven subjects, English, humanities, science to a point. And when we started to dive into reading age, we found some really clear and quite stark correlations between where we were with reading age and where we were with outcomes. We spent an awful long time developing a research-based literacy policy, of which there are lots of words on the screen kind of outlining at the moment. But essentially speaking, the most helpful place we found for a literacy policy was the Education Endowment Foundation. And taking their kind of outline of what a secondary school literacy policy should look like, and using that to formulate our own plan and our own implementation model of how we might improve literacy across the trust, but particularly focused around reading. Now, if you've not read the EEF's guidance, essentially it offers 7 practical evidence-based recommendations that are relevant to all students based on the key concept of disciplinary literacy, aiming to support all teachers in all subjects, helping students with their reading, their writing, and communicating effectively. Now, from that, we've drawn up our own literacy policy, which splits into 5 areas. First off, vocab building and spelling. I'm not going to spend an awful long time or any time on that at all today, but various strategies across the curriculum and across the teaching model to how we develop students' vocabulary. Writing in detail and accuracy, and again, focusing on grammar, but real focus on thinking tools to improve student planning, focus on key scaffolds for key exam skills and key skills required in various subject areas. Again, not got time to talk about that in any great detail today, but it's there. One that I will talk about today is our approach to developing reading and reading understanding and pleasure. Another one, oracy. And then the final one, again, that I'll talk about today is our additional targeted interventions, and how we select students for intervention and how we ensure the interventions that we select students for have impact. So first things first, central to anything to do with reading in Laidlaw Schools Trust secondary phase at the moment is our common reading test, which will make no surprises really, because I'm here today, is the new group reading test. Now, we in 2019 brought new group reading tests for Excelsior Academy, and as I say, the results were stark, and from there we've rolled it out across the trust. Just to give you an idea of where we are, Excelsior Academy, when we first did this reading test, we were barely at 1/3 of students at chronological age in reading. In Sunderland, it's about half, so 50-50. At Sedgefield, it's about 70%, maybe just over, of students at chronological age. So we have got different contexts and different challenges, and we need a policy that works for all, but allows the students who need the help in each school to get that help. The reading age thing initially was quite controversial in the trust, because there were people who thought, you know, reading age doesn't really do much for us, and it took a while to get that message across that it was something we needed to measure. Because for me, reading age tells us an awful lot about students. It tells us their academic, sorry, I'll start that again. It tells us an awful lot about students. It can tell us about their issues with academic performance, possibly, that we might not see in subject areas. You know, I think a student that's prepared for an assessment can do quite well in it, but actually speaking, there might be some fundamental issues that are going to stagnate that student's progress later down the line. And we might pick that up with an issue in reading age that if we weren't testing for, we might never ever see. Equally, we find the reading age tool helps us to identify students that might be missed otherwise, maybe students that have additional need that haven't been identified to us at primary, maybe students who need exam access help that we can explore further, and the reading age flags that up. But really speaking, it helps us to find the students who, and this is a horrible term, have become a little bit stagnant. You know, we do this reading test 3 times across the year, and it helps us to try and see those students who, yes, they might have been okay initially, but for whatever reason, they're not progressing in their reading age as they stay in secondary school. So they might be in year 7 at 12.5 in terms of the reading age and NGRT, but by the end of year 7, they're barely at 13. And that is a student who needs some additional help that we may not have seen otherwise. We track this entirely. We have some very, very complicated and detailed reading age trackers that track the NGRT outcomes and every intervention that we run, so we can see the impact of everything. And it is shared as a measure across the board. So every teacher and every subject can see every student's reading age on class charts and on SIMS. Every teacher has had training, which I'll come to in a bit, about what these reading ages might mean and how they can use some teaching tools to support the students with lower reading ages and how they might access the curriculum content. So what have we done about it? First off, I'll talk to you about the biggest development we've made in teaching and learning around reading. As I said earlier, we've got an awful lot of tools in our teaching and learning model. But the biggest one around reading is we've invested very, very heavily into the concept of reciprocal reading. There are many, many, many tools out there to how you teach reading. We went for reciprocal reading for various reasons, and there's more to come. But at the moment, we felt it really, really important. We just focused on one teaching tool for reading and trying to embed it across the curriculum. So what we did initially is we went into the Trust primary schools and some of our feeder primary schools and started to look for good practice down there of how reading was taught and how we might be able to ensure that reading was taught consistently across the secondary school curriculum. We were pretty confident that every subject was teaching reading to a point, but we didn't really have a method of how teachers might encourage students to read text that they might find difficult. And reciprocal reading was a way that we could get that. Really speaking, what it does for us is it breaks down the reading process. I think the reading process itself is something that teachers can be a little bit guilty of overlooking at times. You know, we have an exam, we have a task that we want the students to do at the end of the lesson, and that task involves some reading. And I speak from an English background here, but if I was looking at an English exam paper, for instance, I have seen some very good English lessons delivered that actually, when you look back at them, how was the text that was so important because it was being analysed, how was that read with the kids? Because if the teachers read that and modelled that reading with the students and kind of, for want of a better term, scooted over that reading, the students might be able to analyse it beautifully once the teachers read that text. But how do we know those students can read that text without those teachers? And I think some of staff were guilty of not focusing enough on that first stage of reading. How do we do it? Now, the reciprocal reading itself is a process that breaks down reading. I don't know what people know and what people don't know. I will whiz through it very quickly in terms of a process, but I'm sure it's something that people, particularly primary practitioners in the webinar, I'm sure it's something that people will be aware of. However, what we did is we sent some key staff on training with FFT and picked up these tools and then adapted it for our own teaching model. So I'll show you some slides in a minute that are standard slides that we develop across and adapt to suit needs across the trust, really. But they fit our teaching model as they stand. But reciprocal reading as a process starts with a recall topic, or at least it does with us. So we try and if we're reading a text about a particular concept in science, we'll try and recall what we know about it before we even start. And one thing we might do is use a circle map. Now, that is a stage we've added just to try and encourage the students to think about what they already know, but then the reciprocal reading process starts. Now, the reciprocal reading process, as I say, is to try and get these students to dive into texts. So first off, we ask them to read a small section of the text independently. It might be the first sentence, it might be the title, it might just be the front cover, and ask them to predict how that text might develop. And we do that to encourage those deeper thinking skills around a text. Now, we don't necessarily ask them to write this down, but it's a discussion. Based on the evidence we've got, how might this text develop and why do you think that? And encouraging that deeper thinking into the text before we even read it. We then, and this is where it would vary, but we then ask the students to read the text. Now, normally speaking, this would be independent, i.e. they would read it to themselves. Now, with lower ability students, we might chunk the text down quite significantly. With higher ability students, it might be quite a significant passage of text. Now, this isn't something you could do, say, with a 250-page novel, but it's certainly something you could do with a short extract or a short story. So we read a section of the text, and once we've read a section of the text, we ask the students to spend some time finding words that they just don't know the meaning of, and asking them to try and clarify the meaning of those words. Now, that clarification can take many different forms. It might be some dictionary work, it might be a discussion, it might be a teacher-led discussion, It might be a modelled clarification where the teachers know or predicted the words the students might struggle with. But the idea is that we are unlocking the meaning of this text for the students by allowing them some time to understand some words that they just might not have done beforehand. I mean, I've just taught a very low ability year 10 class before this and done exactly this process, and the word ancient caused some issue, shall we say. And without this process, I would never have really understood that the students didn't understand what the word ancient meant. And this allowed me to understand that as a teacher, but also it allowed them to have that deeper understanding of the text before I asked them to analyse the language within it. Once we've done that, we explore the text through questioning, students generating questions that they want to find out about the text. And then finally, we write a summary, or we summarise it verbally. So summarise the key points of the text that have been read with the chunk, the whole thing. But this is a process that we've spent an awful lot of time embedding across the curriculum. So we will see reciprocal reading going on in English, we'll see it going on in humanities, we'll see it going on in science. To a point, we'll see it going on with exam questions in subjects like maths. We might not see these comprehensive slides in those subjects, but the process of getting the students to clarify the words and the questions is embedded across the curriculum in all 3 secondary schools in the trust. Now that has had huge impact for us, because we can be sure that reading's being taught in a particular way and that staff are spending the time ensuring that students are equipped with the tools to independently access text if teachers are not there, which ultimately is what they need to do at the end of year 11. So that's the biggest development really in teaching and learning in terms of how we've embedded reciprocal reading. And obviously that's something we've used in lockdown as well. We were able to embed reciprocal reading through our recorded lessons, our live lessons, all the way through the lockdown process, because the students were so used to seeing it in lessons across the curriculum. Something else we do is we have a real focus on reading lessons. Every student in year 7 and 8 across Laidlaw Schools Trust, which I'll come to in a moment, access accelerated reader. There may be different opinions on accelerated reader in this, I don't know. I have my own opinions on accelerated reader, but it is a tool that can have impact if well managed, and we do use it across the trust. So every student will have at least half an hour's accelerated reader time, normally an hour across the week. But some students have a further reading lesson embedded in their timetable. At Excelsior, for instance, because the reading age was where it was, we were given more curriculum time for certain students in certain sets in English, and that allowed us to embed really focused reading lessons for the students who needed it. And what we've done is we've adopted, again, from our primaries and our feeder primaries, we've adopted a book journal approach, which, if you've seen it, essentially chunks text down and asks or gets students to complete comprehension activities based on the text. And they could be comprehension activities that I would have been guilty of 5, 6, 7 years ago, of saying, well, why are we doing that? For instance, one of the reading journals definitely asked the students to read a description of setting, and the activity is draw the setting and label the setting. Now, as an activity, that, you know, it's a drawing in a secondary school. Why are we doing it? But actually, in order to really dive into the meaning of that text, particularly for a student with a particular reading age, they've got to extract every single piece of information from that text to make that drawing accurate. And they've got to justify that drawing and say why certain things are where they are. So as an activity, it has some value. Now, what we found with the book journals in particular, when we adopted this in 2019 and we chunked the text down, we were quite guilty of not really allowing the students time with class readers and things of the sort. You know, we've got hundreds of books in an English stock cupboard that were just gaining dust. As we've developed this over time, what we've actually done is we've now, in these further reading lessons, got class readers operating, but every class reader has a book journal for certain sections of the text, so that students can spend real time diving into those sections of the text and developing their key comprehension skills. So every student in the trust sees reciprocal reading on a daily basis. in lessons across the curriculum. Some students in the trust have these further reading lessons. Every student in year 7 and 8 access accelerated reader. And every single bit of this is obviously trying to improve the reading age from the context we found ourselves in back in 2019. Other things we do, as most schools will do, is trying to foster this love of reading. We've got very well stocked academy libraries in all 3 schools, but we offer various different things to try and encourage reading. Things such as 12 books of Christmas, where staff give out books as Christmas presents for 12 days to students for rewards. Currently reading posters around the school of staff and students of things that they are currently reading. Reading focused slides, so our front slides will often have a picture that says ask me about what I'm currently reading, just to encourage the concept of reading through the school. All this is celebrated on social media and various things of the sort. So that's a kind of very, very, very quick run through of where we are across curriculum with reading. And as I've just said there, we are very fortunate that we've got some very well stocked and very well looked after academy libraries. And the trust believes in that as well, in terms of making sure that the library is a functional resource that we can use. You know, if you walk into Academy 360 in Sunderland, for instance, it's the first thing you see. So central to life of the academy. Planned and promoted student use of the library. We use it for English lessons, but also encourage extracurricular groups and things to take place in there, and the various other bullet points that are on there. So making sure we've got reward schemes, we've got established reading groups, and we are trying to use that space to encourage reading. Now, from there, we are looking at our additional interventions. So I've talked you through really some, and I am using the word some of the key strategies we've used to promote reading across the curriculum. Reciprocal reading is the big one, but then we've got those other things running through. Those further reading lessons have had some real impact. But then now I'm talking more about what are we doing with the students who offer us concern with their reading age. I'm sharing a little bit of data from one of the schools, which is absolutely fine. But essentially speaking, from new group reading tests, we, although we do take the measures a bit more deeply than this, at a very cursory level, we take the reading age and we ask ourselves, well, we categorize into 4 categories: percentage of students who are at chronological age, percentage of students who are less than 18 months below, percentage of students who are more than 18 months below, and then the percentage of students who in that reading test have come out under the age of 7. Now, the age of 7 one is contentious, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But from that, we've developed a tiered reading intervention model, where essentially speaking, every student in year 7 and 8 will participate in accelerated reader. The students who are less than 18 months below will do some form of individualized or small group work with trained members of staff, where they are withdrawn from non-English lessons and non-core lessons. At the moment, the students complete reciprocal reading on a very small basis, so they get some reading age-appropriate short stories, and they dive into the text following that reciprocal reading process that they're familiar with from their lessons. Moving forward, we're highly likely to use a different intervention there as well. We're looking at something called boosting reading potential, where students will work one-to-one 3 times a week for 15 minutes with a trained member of staff. Underneath that, in this kind of significantly below bracket, we use computerized intervention, which is mainly Lexia. And we put the students on Lexia to try and boost their reading age. Now, all these interventions run for about, and I'm using the word about, 10 weeks, because at the end of that 10 weeks, we'll do the next round of new group reading test, and we'll test the impact of these interventions. If we find that an intervention is not working for a student, we are flexible with this. So, you know, if we've put a student on Lexia for 10 weeks, we would know before the end of 10 weeks, if you're familiar with Lex, if it was working or not. But if we didn't, at the end of those 10 weeks, if that student's reading age still hasn't progressed, we will try one of the other interventions. But this is the kind of cursory overview of how we do things for the intervention underneath. The students under the age of 7, we do have the ability to offer a specialised phonics intervention. However, we are yet to use it. Offering secondary school students phonics intervention is something that would be highly contentious, but it is there if we need it. And some of the students with EAL need, we do use it to a point, but we use that more in an EAL context than in a reading context. But it is there if we ever felt like we needed it for a particular student. But we have a very, very focused tiered model, and my PowerPoint's just skipped all the way through there. So in that kind of significantly below bracket, we do use these computer-based interventions. Now, these have been highly, highly useful over lockdown. We invest to Lexia. We also invest in IDL. Now, the reason we invest in both is that the Senkos in the schools have a strong belief that IDL is more appropriate for students with particular SEND need. And to be honest, the outcomes we're seeing would suggest that. Lexia for us, and this has happened weirdly in every single school across the trust, between, and this is over lockdown also, between our first reading age test done in September, October time, and then the reading age test that we did as we returned from lockdown, the students who we had enrolled on Lexia, 66% of them, or thereabouts, in all 3 schools across the trust, had made 6 months or more progress in their reading age above the development between September and March. So it's had some really significant impact. Now, part of that is down to the fact it was an intervention we could run during lockdown, because obviously we could monitor Lexia use from home. But also in every single school, we have a trained member of staff overseeing this intervention, who is normally a support assistant, who is making sure that the students who are enrolled on it are accessing it, and there is time embedded either after school or in curriculum time for certain students where they can access this, and they can do it frequently, at least 2 times a week. So we use Lexia for those students, and as I say, in the tier above, at the moment, we are using reciprocal reading. And essentially speaking, the students will work with a trained member of staff reading an age-appropriate text for an hour and go through this process. And again, this has initially had some impact, but over lockdown, this one was a very difficult thing to do, because sitting down with students and working through text when they weren't in the building was very difficult to do. So what we ended up having to do was postpone this for the time being. And now, as I say, we're looking at potentially adding another intervention to this tier also. The other one that I've mentioned that all students do is accelerated reader. We ensure that every student has access to books, and we use accelerated reader as a way of ensuring that students are reading books. Now, obviously, there might be a draconian thing going on there. However, it's really important that the students that are accessing our schools are getting the chance to read. And accelerated reader gives us a way of measuring that reading. And we use it in a way that the teachers are expected to know the accelerated reader data of their students. Now, there is a part here where AR and NGRT could clash, because obviously AR does provide its own reading age. My personal experience with Star Reader is that it underreports. And often if you compare your Star Reader data to new group reading test, students that Star might flag as a problem, new group reading test does not. So what we use the Star Reader test for is to inform the zone of proximal development, so the book level that the students will be reading in accelerated reader. We do not use it for reading age analysis. That all comes from new group reading test. But what we do use accelerated reader for is we ensure that the students are quizzing regularly. And I say this with genuine sincerity, we are not a school that would hide our reading lessons. We are not a trust that would hide our reading lessons from any external visitors. You know, we believe that the accelerated reader stuff that we are doing and the way that it's managed is allowing students to read and is allowing students to progress, and external visitors would verify that as well. You know, I think secondary schools with AR, it's a very expensive tool that sometimes we buy into, and then it just kind of sits there, and we take our students to a library and they open a book and they read it. But actually, if they don't do a quiz, is it one of those things that slips by the wayside? It doesn't in our schools. We make sure it's used, and we make sure that it's accessed from home. We did, over lockdown, in 2 of the 3 schools, open up the opportunity to read by buying into Accelerated Reader's e-reading system. And we did insist that the reading lessons continued in the recorded lessons, and we did track the reading that was happening in terms of the quizzing, and we did focus on making sure it was still going on. I've mentioned this already, but something that's been really, really key to us is making sure that staff are aware of the reading ages of the students and what that means. So on the screen there, you'll see an anonymized Sims page from one of the schools. You can probably work out which one looking at the pupil premium indicators. However, it tells the staff the reading ages, but what we were finding is the staff, they were just numbers. So we spent a lot of time with staff over lockdown with recorded training sessions of making sure that staff knew what those reading ages meant, and making sure that staff were aware of how they could develop their own practice to ensure that students with low reading ages could access texts. Now, we did reiterate the reciprocal reading through that, particularly, and how we might change our approach to reciprocal reading for lower ability students versus higher ability students. So something we did very cursory was give staff a group of 8 texts, ask them to rank them, ask them to work out what reading age they might be for, and then start thinking about their own practice, and particularly start thinking about what they were setting students to do independently over lockdown. Because, you know, a text that you're asking students to access over lockdown can be very, very, very difficult if the teacher's not there to frame it. So we needed that reciprocal reading process that the students were used to in order to gauge what they could read and what they couldn't, and give them the tools to access what they needed to be able to access. The other thing that carried on during lockdown was the computer-based intervention. In fact, we brought into it more, and we put more students on it who would potentially not have been on it if we were in school. So some of those students who might have been on the reciprocal reading tier ended up on these because we could at least offer something to them whilst they weren't in the building. The other thing we did quite successfully is we rolled the book journal approach that I spoke about earlier out during lockdown. So we went into the English cupboards and we actually sent home some texts that we knew full well we were probably never going to use again. And we sent them home with journals, and there were weekly lessons embedded where students could read and were expected to read and were completing these journals on Google Classroom. We've also brought into ebook systems that we track usage of. So we've brought into Sora from Overdrive. And as I say, we've also got Myon, which is Accelerated Reader's version. I prefer Sora, but personal preference. And then the other thing that continued through lockdown were the lessons. The teaching model was absolutely key to us during lockdown, because the students were so used to the structure of how we taught, particularly concepts such as reading, that when we needed to frame that outside of school, I say outside of school, outside of the school building, we could do that and do it with relative success, because the students could access the texts or access the process to access the text because they were so familiar with it from their time across the curriculum. Now, I've talked very quickly there, and I think that will bring me to the end of my presentation. I hope I've made some sense. I always find these things very strange because you end up talking to a room that can't talk back to you.
I can talk back to you, Alan. That was fantastic. Really, really good insight into what you're doing there across the trust. Can you hear me okay, Alan?
I can hear you perfectly. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
Yeah. So thank you so much for that. Obviously great to see what you're doing with the new group reading test data initially to find out those pupils that need the extra intervention, but also all pupils across the trust. but then some great insights into reciprocal reading. I've heard that term used a lot, and that's the best explanation I've seen, and that your implementation of it just looks fantastic. And then, yeah, your explanation around the targeted interventions. It's great to see so many different strategies being used there as well. So thank you so much. Just before we go on to questions, if I can remind, if anyone has got any questions, if you can use the Q&A button on the bottom right. We've just got a few minutes for some questions, so please type any in there now. Any of the questions that anyone wants to ask after the live session and after viewing the recording, you can put those questions into the forums within our Hoover platform. Just to remind everyone as well, there's a session this afternoon from Advanced Learning Partnership. Rebecca and Sarah are going to be talking about how they've used a systematic approach to using GL data so that all staff can help their pupils from that data. So, Alan, there's a couple of questions. We're just waiting for a few more to come in. First question, could you just explain a bit more about what Lexia is?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a computer-based literacy intervention. Now, obviously, that mere suggestion has controversies, I would say. So essentially speaking, students will complete an initial diagnostic into 3 strands of reading, and from that the program will try and say where they are, and will try and pitch them an appropriate intervention tier where they can improve on those 3 aspects. Now, we tend to find that students struggle more with comprehension than most other things, but there are other things built into Lexia. Now, it's very, very, very interactive. It used to be a program that 5-6 years ago I would have steered away from, but I'm quite impressed with at the moment. It's very interactive, and it is personalized to the students. So they spend about 20 minutes a session working through different elements, and then if they get stuck, it loops them back round again. So if they can't get through the process, it will loop them back round, and then it will loop them back round. And when they hit a point that they can't do, the program requests teacher input, and you can print off an intervention and work through that intervention that way. But it is a personalized computer-based literacy intervention. Some schools use it for SEND students. Personally speaking, I think it has a place for anyone and everyone who might be struggling with reading.
Okay, great. In terms of the reciprocal reading, is that used across all departments? And if so, how often is it used, out of the timetable?
It's used more in your traditional essay-based writing subjects. So English, yes. Humanities, yes. And science, yes. Science have actually embedded a fortnightly reading-focused lesson into every year group apart from year 11. Which was a bit, talking to some of the heads of science was a bit of an eye-opener to them. So they, as they're teaching key concepts of science or revising them, they'll give them a real-world article on that context. And then they'll go through the reciprocal reading process with that article. Now, I was doing some student voice at one of the schools looking at literacy in science, just departmentally. And the students were able very clearly to link the way that the reading was being picked up in science to how they were being taught to read in English. From an English perspective, we're not as strict as that in terms of saying you must get reciprocal reading in every week or every 2 weeks or something of the sort, because we read all the time. But what you'll see in our English lessons is, where appropriate, those slides that I've shown you will be there. Those slides, really speaking, for most staff now have become more of a signpost than an actual slide, shall we say. It was a way of making sure that staff spent the time on the reading that they should spend the time on, if that makes sense. So the process itself, how guilty are we of reading a text with kids and just assuming that they understand what words mean? Whereas actually, if we unlock those words, how much more have we unlocked in terms of their ability to access that and do well with what we want them to do ultimately? Now, that takes more time, and I would certainly say that we did initially see a hit in terms of the amount of content we were getting through when we started embedding this, particularly in English, because we were kind of the front runners. but now it's just become part of daily practice. Humanities, again, they're a bit less strict than science in terms of how they do it, but they do embed slides where appropriate and do embed the process where appropriate. Other subjects, it's more difficult. But there has been a lot of discussion with maths at the moment about how they teach some of the longer exam questions, particularly to lower ability students, and a real focus particularly on that clarification stage of reciprocal reading. I mean, the prediction one in a 4-line exam question is probably pretty pointless. You know, how do you predict this exam question is going to develop? However, they are starting to embed that kind of clarification stage, in particular, any words in this question you don't understand, anything you want, you know, or anything you want to ask me about it, and making sure that the signposts for the students are there so they see the same processes going on. Have I answered that question now? I feel like I might have.
Yeah, definitely. On a similar thread, really, how have you managed to get the buy-in from all faculties to your approach?
I mean, we've undergone a lot in the last 3 years as a trust anyway. The teaching model, if anyone's familiar with the North East, really, they might recognise the teaching model is the Sedgefield model. Sedgefield have joined the trust in the last 2 years, and when Sedgefield joined the trust, we adopted that teaching model across the board, which meant that Sedgefield were already there with the aspects that already existed. The other schools had their own implementation plan to embed the elements of that teaching model as appropriate, and it was very sensible. It was like, you know, this element by this point, this element by this point. Reciprocal reading became an element to embed. So it fell in the implementation plan with everything else. At Sedgefield, it was just the thing that was being focused on that year, the thing that was going to expand that teaching model further. But it fell into the line of the kind of CPD model anyway. It was bumped up because we do appreciate the need we have with reading in some of the schools in the trust. But it's had the buy-in because it's had the same level of delivery and the same amount of time to embed as everything else. We don't like say, here's 10 things you want to see in your lesson, embed them all now. We do here's one thing we want to see in your lesson, embed it, and we'll revisit it in the next CPD and the next one, and we'll make sure it's there before the next thing appears. So it's been part of that process, really. So in many ways, we were quite fortunate that it was coming at the same time we were changing a lot of other stuff.
Right.
But yeah.
How much of a challenge has been getting parents engaged with reading?
Huge. And I haven't really spoken about it in my presentation, actually. We do a lot, but the contexts of the schools offer their own challenges with parental engagement. The policy that I've not shared does kind of outline our approach a little bit more than I've said here, but I mean, I'll answer the question. Huge, more challenging in Newcastle than it is anywhere else, I would say, partly because of the context that the student and the communities that the students come from. But we've done things such as sent letters home about the interventions and the importance of reading age. The websites are in the process of being developed with some very significant reading information and what we do as a trust. The Google Classrooms or the Frog at Sedgefield at the moment are well embedded in terms of literacy resources and interventions that parents can access. One thing we really wanted to do was try and invite the parents in, but obviously COVID's kind of stopped that happening. But it has been a challenge. We do other things as well. So, for instance, when students start in year 7 across the trust, they're all given a free book. Now, that's pretty standard, but that free book then is the English scheme of work for the first 4 weeks when we return across the board. And then the parents are sold that as a challenge and the importance of the reading from the word go, all 3 of the schools. But the parental engagement is without question the most challenging aspect that we have found so far. We have done some things with some success. The after school interventions, the letters that parents have received about that have, most students, I would say in the 90% of students we invite after school for the tiered interventions come without much chasing now. But yes, I would be intrigued when COVID has gone, if COVID has gone, if we were to do a parents reading event, how many we would get in the different schools. And I think that would be a sign of how successful we've been parental engagement.
Yeah.
shall we say.
Great. You talked about some real positives from lockdown, particularly some of the reading ages. Is there any other positives that you've taken away from lockdown?
I think it's shown us how much the students can do independently, and how much the students sometimes lean on us as staff when they don't necessarily need to. I'm not necessarily talking about reading there, but you know, some of the work that our students have produced during lockdown is incredible. And you know, initially during lockdown, although we had quite significant live input by the end, initially during lockdown we had a very heavy recorded input, and even then the students were able to produce work to a very, very, very high standard. And that independence, I think, is a real positive, but we've just got to kind of foster that independence now and allow, you know, as they return into school, really. And obviously that's not all of them either, but
yeah, brilliant. That's all the questions we've got for you, Alan. I just want to say a huge thanks to you. I know you're really busy at the moment, centre assess grades, etc., etc. So to get your time for an hour just to explain what you've been doing is going to help a lot of people. So really do appreciate it.
Not a problem. And if anyone has got any points they want further clarification on, or any bits of that policy they want further information on, they are welcome to it. Yeah, you can facilitate that in some way, Darren.
Yeah, we've got forums on our Hoover platform, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free to add those in, and we can communicate with Alan and get any answers to that.
And I hope I was of use there. I feel in these virtual presentations at time, I end up waffling to a camera because you don't get any feedback. It's very difficult to stay on track. However,
you certainly didn't waffle. It was all really clear, and
perfect.
Yeah, we're really grateful to you. Thanks, Alan. And thanks everyone for joining today. I know everyone's really busy at the moment, but hope you found it useful. And we look forward to seeing everyone on the next session. Thanks, Alan.
No problem. Thank you.